Thank you so much for this very vivid debate. It is a perfect, I think, introduction for the next speaker, Maurits Barendrecht. He is the Director of Research and Development at HiiL, and he will be talking about what is better justice under the broad umbrella of technology to support a people-centered justice. What's at stake if and when we bet on radical innovation, and what is the added value that it can bring? Please welcome to the stage Maurits Barendrecht.
Thank you very much. I would like to put up some slides. Well, I thank you for inviting me to share ideas on how technology can support people-centered justice. Next slide, please. This is how access to justice is usually seen. This is what I experienced as a practicing lawyer at the beginning of my career. When I became a professor, studying access to justice was about complex laws and adversarial procedures. Now, as R&D director at HiiL, I oversee data collection and assist in dialogues where justice leaders see many things that need to be fixed. Reduce the backlogs, simplify the laws, digitize the files, lower the cost of legal aid, tackle corruption, teach people about their rights. So much that needs to be done, each very hard in itself. Next slide, please. Will technology resolve the access to justice gap? That's, of course, the big theme of today's conference. HiiL works in access to justice innovation for 10 years. We have an accelerator for justice startups. And these are the kind of ideas that come up all the time. But let's be a little bit realistic. Can we really expect them to come true anytime soon? Will they really ensure equal access to justice for all? Next slide, please. Yesterday afternoon, you heard a lot about people-centered justice. This is what it is about and who is involved. And you see quantifying the justice gap. You see evidence-based working. You see opening up to innovation. Next slide, please. This is what you do when you take people-centered justice seriously. You go into data. You get complicated graphs. Sorry, audience, for this. You see, you need interpretations. You need trends. This slide shows you some data from my country. My country is special in that our Ministry of Justice has commissioned legal needs surveys already 4 times. So we now know how access to justice has developed over 16 years. Let me highlight 3 findings. Justice problems are less resolved by decisions or agreements than in the past. It dropped from 60% in 2009 to 39% in 2019. The use of courts dropped from 6% in 2003 to 3% in 2019. Use of lawyers, police, and trade unions is also dropping. And this is not taken over by alternatives, such as mediation or innovative providers. Of course, these data need interpretation, but the message seems to be clear. When people face justice problems, they seem to turn away from lawyers and courts. They are more on their own, they achieve less of their goals, and they experience less fairness. Next slide, please. This slide that you already saw is about the worldwide developments. And you may have seen these graphs before. The rule of law is declining. And the same is true for the quality of democracy and human rights. Next slide, please. This is really urgent. In the near future, you may find yourself being part of a task force implementing people-centered justice systematically. Next slide, please. Actually, you may already be a member of a task force. Many organizations exist that have people-centered justice somehow on their agenda. You may work at strategies at your ministry. You may work as a team of justice innovators. You may work in a legal expenses insurance company like ARA. In a way, you are a task force on people-centered justice. Next slide, please. Based on our 15 years of being active in justice innovations, we developed 5 elements of a rigorous strategy. It's based on data. It's about evidence-based working. It's about game-changing services. It's about enabling legal systems and strengthening a movement that will not happen automatically. In the next 6 minutes, I will go into this a bit more deeply. Next slide, please. First, data. The OECD and others have recommended to do regular surveys on justice needs and outcomes, justice as people experience it. They should happen every year, so progress can be monitored. Next slide, please. In the EU, this is not yet done systematically, although interestingly, the methods have been developed here in England, which doesn't belong to the EU anymore, but these methods are very much European. We ourselves did surveys in Ethiopia and in the US. It is amazing what kind of data you can find and how much you can learn from these data. Next slide, please. Actually, one American organization, the World Justice Project, has surveyed 1,000 people in the biggest 3 cities of 20 EU countries. And the survey tells us what problems EU citizens encounter. This is kind of indicative of the capacity justice systems in the EU need to have. From 100 EU citizens, every 2 years, 6 experience problems with debt collection, 4 experience threats from violence from ex-partners, 7 have problems with landlords. This is the capacity we need to create in the justice system. Next slide. A task force on access to justice should focus on solving or preventing these problems in the best possible way. Take arrests and police violence. 2% of citizens in the EU experience this every 2 years. Luckily, not more than possibly in the US. Are we sure that they get the best possible process in every European town? Whether they go to the police, to a lawyer or appear in court to complain about police conduct? Next slide, please. Unlawful arrests are different from unfair dismissal, debt problems, or separation. Each requires different outcomes. The OECD recommends that for each type of justice problems, outcomes are defined and monitored. This is an example of outcomes for divorce cases. Because outcomes are different, justice problems need to be different, justice processes need to be different. The data support specialization in justice services. What you see here is outcomes that are established by an Australian research group. They very much looked at the outcomes that divorcing couples need, like good parenting agreements. And of course, that is different from treating police violence. Next slide, please. Data show that from 60 people having a justice problem, 34 get stuck or are unsatisfied with the outcome. Only 2 obtain a decision, and agreement is the most common way to resolve problems. Actually, it is generally the best way. When more people find agreed solutions in a country, satisfaction with resolution goes up. Next slide, please. This explains an EU and worldwide trend. You see this everywhere. Everywhere there's more settlement, more mediation, more problem solving, more online dispute resolution, which combines education with mediation and information. In our 2018 report, we showed that demand for justice is not so much demand for judgments. There's much more demand for agreed, coordinated solutions. Next slide, please. Data and research and best practices have to come together in the field of justice. This is why experts recommend evidence-based practice. So judges, lawyers, legal practitioners working at insurance companies, social workers, therapists, prosecutors, police, and providers of justice tech can all be more effective. Next slide, please. The next thing a task force needs to address is getting effective solutions to people. How can we ensure that every woman in the EU who experiences domestic violence gets a good solution? Next slide, please. This is what the data show about where people go. Our institute gets many questions about the market for justice services. People get help, but more from friends and family than from professionals. That's what these data show. Fewer people than we would expect mention money or distance as a barrier. Next slide, please. The data clearly show that the potential for better justice services is huge. Court fees and expensive lawyers are less of a problem than the quality of the services. Court decisions and lawyer advice may have great legal quality, but as we saw, people prefer agreed solutions and specialization. Courts and lawyers have been there for many years, but they still do not succeed to deliver justice services at scale to every corner of Europe. Next slide, please. These are the bright spots. Internationally, these are the game-changing models for justice services. Justices of the peace and other community justice services models are promising. We heard about the Civil Resolution Tribunal as an example of an online court from Richard Susskind. These are the new justice technologies in which governments could invest. Next slide, please. We talked about how a task force can promote evidence-based solutions for justice problems and about game-changing justice services. A task force should also look at regulation. Does it block innovation, allow it, promote it? Next slide. As you may know, the EU was ahead of the rest of the world in 2000s when it promoted free movement of professional services, including legal services. Silicon Valley did not contribute much to justice innovation because in the US, it was a crime to give legal advice unless you passed the bar exam. This is now changing. The EU risks staying behind. Do we really want our innovative justice services to be delivered from across the channel, across the ocean, or even taking the Silk Road to Europe? Next slide, please. EU governments can now benefit from experiments and policy documents elsewhere. European task forces may want to consider these insights. This is what innovation-friendly regulation could look like. A level playing field, a social policy for single lawyers and small law firms who really need to make a transition. We talked about that in the panel. A regulator for all justice services, not just for the bar and for the judiciary. An outcome activity-focused regulation to protect users. Next slide, please. In 2003, Juan Botero, a key member of the famous World Bank Doing Business team, and then the founder of the World Justice Project Rule of Law Index. He is now a professor in Bogota and my colleague at HiiL. He co-authored a leading paper on judicial reform. How does judicial reform look like and what makes it so difficult? The conclusion, lack of incentives. Judiciaries, ministries, and bar associations are independent, which is good, but it also protects them. And the price is lack of innovation. Justice institutions need mild pressure to change. Next slide, please. This is why it is so important to join forces. Justice is a shared challenge. People across Europe face the same justice problems. They need similar solutions. Next slide, please. A small country like the Netherlands or Portugal cannot make the transition to people-centered justice alone. The EU can bring together thousands of innovators and millions of justice practitioners who want to deliver more value to their clients. This is basically what an EU-wide task force could do. Final slide, please. At HiiL, we try to bring together insights on implementing people-centered justice. I started with showing the urgency. Every 2 years, 34 out of 100 European citizens are disappointed by the justice system. 24 experience hardship. We need to and can tackle this by relying on data, by adopting evidence-based practice, by developing game-changing justice services, by a regulatory environment that promotes justice innovation, and by putting mild but subsistent pressure on justice institutions. Equal access to justice for all is possible. The future of justice is in your hands, in our hands. Thank you very much.